Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Now this is the Radeon HD 6970. It's the successor to the 5870, not the 5970 from the previous generation because that was a dual GPU. Two GPUs on one board, onboard crossfire straight out of the box. The 6970 however is a single GPU solution. It sort of traded blows with the GTX 570 from Nvidia at the time of its launch in 2010. It cost a little bit more, and to be honest, either one was a good choice. Now the 6970 in 2022 can be a little bit overpriced on second-hand selling sites, and I just wanted to say that if you do see one of these, it's probably not worth the price it's listed for because it's limited in terms of gaming these days. Not just driver support, but DX support as well. It's a DX11 card, not DX11.1, so you are going to be limited as to the games you can play. So I just thought I'd make a video on it because this is possibly my last video on the 6000 series GPUs. You can get modded drivers or whatever and they'll certainly help in some situations, but with a card like this that's just limited in terms of hardware, well, it's not going to be a very wise purchase in 2022 unless you're going to play certain supported titles like Fortnite and GTA. So let's start off with some context, test a couple of games that were out at the time of this card's release, just to see what it would have been like to use one of these back in the day, and then we'll move on to some more modern games and some of my favourites as well. So let's get into it. So first up we have Call of Duty Black Ops, the latest Call of Duty that was out at the time of this card's release. The 6970 can hit the 91 FPS cap just fine. The average and 1% lows, the 0.1% low as well, is pretty solid, and the game runs fairly well, or very well considering that we are averaging the built-in cap. As you can see, this card back in 2010 then would have been able to handle the latest COD very easily, even with the highest in-game settings that I've selected here at 1080p resolution, though perhaps 1900 by 1200 would have been more common back in the day. I'm glad to see that one of my favourite Call of Duty games, however, can run quite nicely on this old flagship GPU. As I said at the start, these are a little bit overpriced, at least the ones I've seen, and I think unless you plan on playing older titles like this or Fortnite or GTA, then you're not really going to want to opt for one. A 7000 series GPU would make more sense with modded drivers, something like that, or maybe an older RX card from AMD. Another favourite of mine from back in the day, Mafia 2. This is Mafia 2 Classic now, I think it's called, because there was a re-release of the game. It came out as a trilogy. This runs very well too, with over 60 frames per second at 1080p. We are using the highest graphical details once again, with all the extras like anti-aliasing enabled, and I never get tired of this game. It's one that I always tend to play through at least once a year, so it's nice to see that even an old card like this can handle it. Of course, this was probably one of the more demanding games that came out with this GPU, or when this GPU did. At least that's how I remember it. I remember not being able to run Mafia on my hardware very well, but then again, my hardware at the time was pretty terrible, so that could be a key factor in that statement. The card also stays very quiet, which is always nice to hear, so the 6970 back in 2010 would have ticked a lot of boxes, especially at the $369 price tag. This or the 570 from Nvidia would have been a decent choice. I recently heard that Assassin's Creed Origins, one of my favourites, was getting a 60 FPS patch on next-gen consoles, and that put me in the mood to download it again for PC. Unfortunately for me and you guys watching, I did have the 6970 in the system at the time, and it does not perform very well with this card at all. 20 to 21 FPS in busier areas. I'd say it's more about 20 FPS in busier cities, towns, settlements, but outside of that, when we're just running across the massive open world, this frame rate does increase a little bit. It sort of shoots up to around 25, but we are running at 720p with the very low graphical preset, and not only that, we're using 50% resolution scaling, so this is what, 360p, something like that, and we still can't get a very good frame rate at all. I think this version of Assassin's Creed came out in 2016, might be a bit later, but it doesn't run on this card very well at all. In contrast to Assassin's Creed Origins, Battlefield 5 will run very well at 720p, albeit again with the lowest settings. This time, however, we were using 100% resolution scaling, so no dodgy 360p or 480p resolutions this time around. I can't speak for all of the maps, but I do know that at this resolution, the game is certainly playable. It can be quite difficult to see some enemies on screen, but it's not impossible to play, and even someone like me who's terrible at Battlefield games even managed to squeeze in a couple of kills with this 6970 as well. The guy with the crappy old graphics card has probably wiped someone out with a 3060 Ti. I don't know. I shouldn't really call the card crappy. I mean, this was a beast back in the day. It really was quite something, and I think it was probably on my list of dream components. That and the GTX 500 series from Nvidia, the 570 or 580, would have been one of the cards that I probably wished for. Instead, I had a A4 3300 APU, and you can imagine how well my gaming experience went with that. If you have a card like this and you want to play Fortnite, then I've got good news. It's going to run pretty well with performance mode with this card, over 100 FPS, which is quite surprising, but the performance mode that was added to this game has been a lifesaver for a lot of my older graphics cards. I'm sure it's helped a lot of you guys out as well, because it runs a lot better with these settings than it does with the lowest regular preset. So it's a nice addition to the title, and it means that even older games like this, just plain old DX11 GPUs, can run the game, albeit with the usual stutters here and there, but nothing too bad. It's perfectly playable in my opinion. I certainly could have opted for lower graphics settings in GTA 5, but I went with normal in terms of the texture quality, and everything else was on high, so I was probably pushing this card to its limit, but plus 30 FPS isn't going to be difficult to achieve at all, and overall I was pretty happy with this performance. It certainly beats the older gen consoles, even if it's not quite up to par with newer console experiences, but that's to be expected with a 12-year-old graphics card or 11.5-year-old graphics card. Apart from that though, GTA 5 is certainly what I would call playable, and if you can find an old card like this going cheap and you want to play GTA, then it will run it just fine, but again you'd probably want something newer. While Skyrim Special Edition runs fine, this is the newer DX11 version of the game, you'd certainly be better off with the older version of Skyrim for a more solid experience. That said, this card can handle the newer version just fine, so not too much to worry about here. That is if you don't mind at least 30 FPS, because 60 FPS will probably require either a lower resolution or a lower preset. But again, if you don't mind choosing from one of those options, then you can have a 60 FPS experience with this newer version of the game. But personally, I think I would stick to vanilla Skyrim, 2011 Skyrim, if I'm being completely honest. The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt could have also benefited from lower graphical settings. It did run fine, but in busier areas, busier cities, we did see a few dips here and there. I was using medium, so that could be a potential problem. Low is probably better for the 6970, but if you want at least 30 FPS, then you're going to have a solid-ish experience, especially if you're outside of those busier places, but it's certainly what I'd call playable. If you wanted to play The Witcher 3 and you had a limited graphics card budget, a 6970 would do if it was the right price, but as I said before, I often see these valued higher or selling for more than what I think they're actually worth given the circumstances, given the DX11 limitation and given the fact that driver support ended a good few years ago. So yeah, I don't think it's the best idea. I think we'll leave the 6000 series from AMD there. With everything said then, I'm sort of glad to see that the 6970 could still pull its weight in some gaming scenarios, but I do think these cards are better left on the second-hand shelf in 2022. I think they might end up being more frustrating than actually beneficial to your gaming experience unless you are playing older games exclusively, in which case an old flagship like this might be a good choice. If not for gaming purposes, then maybe you're just a collector and you want a piece of gaming history. It certainly appeals to me in that respect. Thank you very much for watching then. If you enjoyed it, leave a like. Leave a dislike if you didn't. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already, and hopefully I'll see all of you in the next one.